Hello, everyone, and welcome into the show today. I hope everyone is having a wonderful afternoon, morning, or night whenever you're listening to this. My name is Trent Osborne, and it is episode 3 of this podcast type content. Still don't know what to call it. If you guys have any ideas, let me know. Today, we are going to get into, as you can see from the title, the idea of parity, air quotes around parity in the NBA, and we'll get into that in a second. I know we did the NBA Mythbusters gimmick last week, and that was cute. I got a lot of good feedback on that. We're going to do it again, and it's going to be the entire episode. All I have heard since Kawhi Leonard signed with the Los Angeles Clippers is that, oh, the gracious Kawhi Leonard has single-handedly ended the super team era and brought parity back to the NBA, right? The dynasty killer, as people have been calling him, the dynasty killer, because he definitely made LeBron go back to Cleveland, and he definitely made Kevin Durant tear his Achilles and made Klay Thompson tear his ACL. But I digress. The dynasty killer, out of the graciousness of his heart, has brought balance to the NBA, right? Spare me. It's ridiculous. This idea that the NBA hasn't had parity in years and that every NBA season since the Warriors became the Warriors has just been a foregone conclusion grinds my gears to no end. And I have been waiting to talk about this for a few months now. So what we're going to do first is we're going to go over why saying that the 2010s had no parity is ridiculous, and then we're going to go into comparing them to the past decades, to the decades of the past, because not only was there great parity in the NBA in the 2010s, there was more parity this decade than any other decade in NBA history. And if that sounds ridiculous, wait until I can tell you why it's not and why it's ridiculous to think otherwise. So there's this idea to start off. We'll just talk about the last 5 years, the Golden State era. Let's just call it that. That the NBA championship, or at least the finals matchup, was a foregone conclusion from the outset, and that there was just no difficulty in the Warriors making the finals and no difficulty in LeBron making the finals with the Cavaliers. Baloney. It's ridiculous. It's untrue. This idea, and I'll use a pro wrestling analogy. If any of you listening are pro wrestling fans, will know exactly what I mean. If a pro wrestling match is predictable, right? Let's say John Cena is wrestling Randy Orton for the WWE title. I don't know. And you go into it, and you're like, oh, John Cena is definitely going to win, right? There's no way that he's not going to win. And then throughout the match, they have these great near falls, and there's this anticipation in the air, like, oh, maybe he did it, or oh, John Cena kicks out at 2 3/4. Oh, Randy Orton almost had him, and it's this great, exciting match. And then John Cena in the end pulls it through, and people just sit back, oh, boring. Oh, that's predictable. It's ridiculous. You can't please anybody nowadays. There was only one season where the Golden State Warriors breezed through the NBA with no difficulty, and that's 2017. I think they lost one game the entire playoffs, and that was in the finals to Cleveland. That year it was a foregone conclusion, and there was no difficulty. What other year did they not have adversity? And we'll just look at the Warriors for now. 2015, LeBron and Matthew Dellavedova took them to 6 games in the finals. So there's a battle there. We go to 2016. They didn't even win. The Cavs won in 7 games, and one of the best series, most exciting game 7s of all time. I'm not going to say the series, because the series had their own issues. I'm going off on a tangent. 2017, there was no difficulty in the Warriors making the finals and winning the finals. 2018, They go to 7 games against the Houston Rockets and barely edge it out. Like, what, that wasn't exciting? That did make you think the Rockets might pull this one out. Chris Paul got hurt. Now, Chris Paul getting hurt didn't make the Rockets miss 27 consecutive threes in that game 7, but who knows if Chris Paul sways that? We don't know. We don't know at full strength who would have won that game 7. Would James Harden have held up? We know his history of choking in the playoffs. That's a whole other thing. Point being, to say that there's no difficulty in the Warriors in that run is ridiculous. And that's all people said after the Warriors won the title. 2019, they didn't win, obviously. And even when they were at full strength, they had issues with the LA Clippers, of all people. They had issues with the LA Clippers, the 8 seed. Took them to 6 games in the first round. And then they go to the finals, everyone gets hurt, and they lose. LeBron went to multiple Game 7s in 2018. Went through plenty of tough series, even if people don't want to remember it that way, throughout his run. Raptors the same way. Raptors this year in the East went through 7 games with Philly, and it took one of the greatest shots in playoff history to knock them off. And then they had to run into the MVP and Giannis and the Bucks in a series that wasn't too tough, but tough nonetheless. That's just the last 5 years. So I want to put this into perspective, and this is the main point. In the 2010s, there were 7 different teams that won NBA titles. 3 of them won their first titles in franchise history. Those 7 teams being the Lakers, the Mavericks, the Heat, the Spurs, the Warriors, the Cavs, and the Raptors. Now, let's compare that to the annals of NBA history. And we're only going to talk about the modern era. We're going to talk about from the 80s to now, because there was no parity in the NBA whatsoever pre-1970, and it's better if we just forget the 1970s ever happened. That's a whole other issue, and it's sad because a lot of great players like Spencer Haywood and Wes Unseld get lost to history because of that, but the 1970s almost crippled the league. We'll just skip over that. Let's go to the 80s, where there were 4 teams that won NBA titles between 1980 and 1989. The Lakers, the Celtics, the Sixers, and the Pistons. But that's awesome, right? You got Magic and Bird and the Lakers and the Celtics. That's awesome. But LeBron versus the Warriors? Boo. Boo. That sucks, right? We don't want to see that. Boo. And before people get on their soapbox, the 1980s were this paradigm of basketball sanctity, and teams were built from the top to the bottom, and it wasn't about the superstars. Whatever. 4 teams won the NBA title in the 1980s. Do you know how many teams made the finals? 5. 5 different teams made the finals in the 1980s. The Lakers, the Celtics, the Sixers, the Pistons, and the Houston Rockets were the only teams that even made the finals. The 80s were ridiculously top-heavy, but no one has an issue with it because it's Magic and Bird. And no one should have an issue with it. Because if you're seeing great basketball, you're seeing great basketball. And those series were always fun and always entertaining. Throughout the 80s, we saw good final series. Now let's go to the 90s. And this is going to rile some people up, I can tell, because the 90s are just the greatest era of basketball of all time, right? Nothing touches the 90s and Michael Jordan and Patrick Ewing and ooh. The 90s, how many teams won NBA championships in the 90s? 4, again. Pistons, Bulls, Rockets, Spurs. For an 8-year span, 2 different teams won the NBA title. Bulls won it 3 years in a row. Michael left. The Rockets won it 2 years in a row. Now Michael came back the second year and still lost to the Magic. Let's not forget that. That's a little nugget of information that NBA historians would like for you to forget. They would like for you to think that Michael Jordan just didn't lose in the playoffs in the 90s, but I digress. And then Michael, quote unquote, came back at full strength if you ask his fan club, and then he won 3 more consecutive finals. And then the Spurs won one to to patch off the decade. The Bulls faced little to no difficulty most of the time. Like, these series went to 5 or 6 games, but come on. Let's look at the teams that were going up against the Bulls in the 90s. You've got the Portland Trailblazers. With Clyde Drexler's a great player, don't get me wrong, and you have Terry Porter. Like, they're good teams. You have the Suns, which were a great team. You know, Charles Barkley, Kevin Johnson, Dan Marley. It was a great team. The Lakers in 91, I believe, yes, the 91 finals, Magic Johnson and Byron Scott didn't play, and Kareem had retired, so, you know, whatever. A real tough competition in the finals. And then we go back to the second string of three-peats for the Bulls. So the year prior, in the 95 playoffs, they lose to the Magic. They lose to the Magic in the playoffs. What do they do in the offseason? They already have the greatest coach of all time. They already have arguably the greatest player of all time. And one of the greatest defenders of all time, in Scottie Pippen, of course. So what do? They go out and add, in my opinion, the greatest rebounder of all time, Dennis Rodman, and one of the best defenders ever in Dennis Rodman. To add to that, oh yeah, that 96 team, one of the greatest teams, if not the greatest team in NBA history, but people will have you convinced that, oh, super teams didn't start until LeBron, right? Maybe. The precursor to the super team were the Celtics in 08. Whatever. Get out of here. Super teams have always been in the NBA. None more apparent than the 96 Bulls up until the Warriors. The Warriors are the biggest quote-unquote super team ever. But look at that Bulls team in 96. Jordan, Rodman, Pippen, one of the greatest coaches of all time in Phil Jackson, one of the greatest shooters of all time in Steve Kerr, one of the greatest six men of all time in Tony Kukoc. That is a super team if I've ever seen one. Oh, but the 90s were this paradigm of parity. These teams were great. Michael Jordan's just that good, right? Spare me. And this isn't meant to be some Michael Jordan hate piece. He's one of the top, the furthest on your top players of all time list you can put Michael Jordan is third. I would put LeBron James ahead of him, but that's a podcast for another day. And I think you could make a very good argument to put Kareem Abdul-Jabbar ahead of him. I wouldn't go that far. I've got Michael at number 2, but I just want to preface that and say that I love Michael Jordan. I've got a poster of him on my wall right now. He's one of the greatest of all time. And the hype on Michael Jordan is legit until it becomes ridiculous. Like this idea that the Bulls would have won 8 straight finals if he never went to go play baseball. That's one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard. And to some people, that's like common knowledge. They're like, what, you don't think that? It's ridiculous to me. So then we go to the 2000s. The parity ups a little bit. It gets a little bit better. 5 teams won the NBA title. The Lakers won it 4 times. The Spurs won it 3 times. Then the Pistons, the Heat, and the Celtics got one. Five teams won NBA titles in the 2000s. That's still 2 less teams than in the 2010s. But, the 2010s are this ridiculously lopsided era of basketball. You know what I'm saying? But the 2000s were great. There was a lot of parity in the 2000s, except in those years where the Lakers and the Spurs were going on their runs, but the league was still top-heavy. When Phil and Shaq left, the Lakers were down, but the second Phil came back and they got even a borderline superstar back with Kobe in Pau Gasol, the Lakers were contending again. The point I'm trying to make is that throughout NBA history, the league has always been top-heavy. There has never been a season where there were more than 5 teams that were legitimate contenders for the NBA title. There's never been a season in NBA history where there were more than 5 teams that if they won the NBA title, that they would be like, oh yeah, well, not much of a surprise there if we're going to be honest. No, the league's always been top-heavy. If you want to argue that in recent years it's been Like, very recent years, since KD went to Golden State, it's been a bit more top-heavy than others. Fine. If you want to pick and choose years that were more top-heavy than others, you can do that. But this idea that the 2010s, that this super team era, as people have dubbed it, has just been awful for the league, I think it's ridiculous. I think it's not fair. I think we've seen some of the greatest teams of all time, but we've had equally as good teams to combat them. People hate on LeBron's 3-6 finals record, but look at the teams he was going up against. Like, the Popovich dynasty and the Popovich teams have always been good, no matter who was on the team until just recently. He had to go up against these Warriors teams, which could very well be the greatest teams of all time. This could be the greatest dynasty that the NBA has seen in the modern era. You can definitely make that argument. This is what he's had to compete against. The level of play in the 2010s is upped than it was in any decade previous, because that's how evolution works. The 2020s are going to be better than the 2010s. The 2030s are going to be better than the 2020s, and so on and so forth. Unless we have another decade like the 70s when everybody gets an affiliation with crack cocaine, every decade is going to build upon the last. Steve Kerr had a quote about that it's ridiculous to insinuate, he was being facetious and said in a different way, I'm paraphrasing, but his point was, it's ridiculous to think that basketball players and athletes are getting worse as time goes on. That, for lack of a better term, it's dumb. It's a dumb opinion to have. And yes, is the NBA set up in this next upcoming season to potentially have the most parity the league has ever seen? Yeah, it is. And it's awesome. And I can't wait to see this upcoming season. I haven't been this excited for an NBA season, maybe ever. Hopefully my Lakers can bring it home. We'll see. But that is what I wanted to talk about today. Thank you all for listening so much. I had a lot of fun recording this episode. It's why I was anticipating it so much. Hopefully you guys will come back for me next week. I'm not sure what the topic will be. If you have anything you would like to hear or any suggestions, let me know on Twitter, and you can go follow me there at Trent Osborne FS, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you guys for listening. See you later.